This is part 2 of 2 of the Chushogi How to Play video series. If you haven't watched the first video already, I'd encourage you to watch that first before watching this video. Please find a link in the corner above. And in this video, we'll be covering different topics such as the rules for promotion, the rules for endgame, and as well as the very complicated lion rules that are a huge part of Chushogi. It's actually not possible to play a normal game of Chushogi without understanding these rules first, so please make sure you continue to stay tuned for the rest of this video to get the complete how to play Chushogi rundown. And at the end of this video, I'll also go over topics such as piece values and basic strategies so that you know how to get started playing this game. Now before I get started, this is actually my first video series using Nishogi, and I wanted to show you how to change some settings in order to match what I'm showing here in the video. So as I mentioned in the last video, I'm using the internationalized set, but some people don't know how to pick that. So if you go to the top right and choose your username, if you go down to piece set, you can actually choose all your piece sets for shogi as well as chushogi. So chushogi pieces are on the bottom, and as of this video, there are 4 different sets. So you could choose the kanji set, the internationalized set, which I've been using in the last video, a black and white internationalized set, as well as a mnemonic abstract set. So actually in this video, I'll probably bounce back and forth between the internationalized set and the black and white internationalized set, especially in the latter because I'll be talking about black lines and white lines. And for people who are not as well versed with shogi terminology, it'll probably be easier when the lines are actually black and white. Now on top of that, you can also change your board theme, and there are many different board themes to choose from, as well as custom themes where you can make your own color or background, which is very customizable. And so for chess players who need something with different colored squares, especially with all the diagonal movements in Chushogi, you could even use a checkered board pattern, just like in chess. Or you could have different textures to your boards, or background patterns. But for this video, I'll stick with the more wooden style themes. One last thing I wanted to cover is if you go to preferences, you could change some key features here. It's very helpful to change the board layout between side and compact. Compact means that your pieces in hand will be on the side of the board rather than on the right side of the window. For Chushogi, there are no drops, so this doesn't really matter as much. And if you go to Shogi Clock on the top left, you can change some key features here. For example, when you're in Byoyomi and your timer is ticking down, when do you want it to start making noises for you? Initially it's set at 3 seconds. I like it at 10 seconds so that I have time to prepare myself before I do anything stupid or lose the game. There are also a bunch of other features you can change in preferences, and I'll let you figure that out on your own, but those are the key ones I wanted to mention. So anyways, let's go back into Chushogi itself. Let's start with promotion. In the last video, I mentioned how the pawn isn't forced to promote upon the last rank, and I'll get to why that is in a bit. But aside from that, the rules of promotion are also different from shogi, and they're a little bit more complicated. So as in shogi, you have the option to promote when you reach the promotion zone, which is one of the last 4 ranks of the board. And so here I have this setup where the go-between is on the verge of promotion, which I'll do, but since I have the option, I can choose to keep it as go-between, and I'll do that just to illustrate the rules. Now, why might you want to underpromote? A lot of pieces change their functionality when they go to the promoted side, and so there's some reason why you might want to keep the original form just so you could use their abilities. So for example, like the side mover and the vertical mover, they can move in a direction that's not reflected in their name, but when they promote to the ox or the boar, they lose that ability. So that's just one example. Anyways, now that I made a go-between, I can't actually promote when I move within the promotion zone, so I'm just going to illustrate that here. See, it still stays as a go-between, and I didn't even get the option to promote. I can't get the option to promote until I move back out of the promotion zone and back in. And so I'm going to let my go-between do that. And here again, I have the option to promote, and I'm going to stay under promoted. Now there's one other way where I could promote within the promotion zone, and that's if I capture a piece within the promotion zone, and now I have the option to promote. And I'll do so here. So one final rule regarding promotion is going back to the pawn, and that's if the pawn reaches the last rank. So I'm gonna walk this pawn over here, So over here, the pawn can move forwards, and it doesn't have the option to promote. But if it reaches the very last rank, it gets one more option to promote, because it can't move anymore. So the pawn is really the only piece that gets this option without having to capture a piece. So that's the rules for promoting when you choose to not promote. It's different from shogi, but in most cases you're going to want to promote as soon as you reach the promotion zone. Next, I want to quickly go over endgame situations. So to quickly summarize, checkmate, eliminate all the opponent's royal pieces. Now I just want to emphasize that on Lee Shogi, you actually have to manually take the king to win. It won't recognize a checkmate when you're in the position. And that's because there's a king and potential for a prince. So the game just ends when both of them are captured. There is stalemate when the opponent can't move any more pieces. And when he can't, he moves his king into a position where it can be captured and he therefore loses. And then next is repetition. So repetition is a lot like shogi, where if the game state repeats itself for the 4th time, the player making that repetition loses. There are a few more complex rules for repetition, especially as the player can effectively pass, which I'll get to in a bit, but I'll leave them out of this video for the sake of simplicity. There's also another way to end the game, which is through a rule called the bear king, and that's if a player has no more pieces other than one king left. At that point, they've effectively lost. Although I don't think that's actually implemented in Lee Shogi, but if you're actually that player with one king left, I think you should just save both you and your opponent some time and resign. Finally, also like shogi, if you make an illegal move, technically that's a loss. That said, if you were to play true shogi on the board, especially with an inexperienced player, it might be nice to give him a little bit of leniency because this is a pretty long game. Next, we're going to go into the interesting set of lion rules in this game. Now, the rules for capturing lions is very particular, and it makes it so that lions are very difficult to be traded with one another. In chess, players might opt to trade each other's queens to simplify the game a little bit. In true shogi, the rules prevent you from doing that. So let's start with the most common scenario here. If each lion is protected by another piece, so for example, black's lion is protected by this dragon, while white's lion is protected by this horse, you can't actually capture the other lion. So right now it's white's turn to move, but see how I can't attack black's lion? It's because black's dragon can recapture on the next turn. However, the next part of this rule is that this only applies to 2 lions that are 2 squares away from each other. So now I have a situation where the white lion is 1 square away from the black lion. When they're 1 square away from each other, everything is fair game. The black lion can take that lion and go back, or even in this case, go forward and take that white horse. The next couple of rules involve in-between pieces, which are pieces between the 2 lions. And these in-between pieces have different rules depending on whether they are pawn or go-between, or any other piece. So in this example, you see an in-between piece that's protecting the white lion. So here's a pawn and here's a lance. So normally you can't just take the other lion because it's being protected, but you can take the lance and then the lion, and that's legal because the lance is not a pawn or a go-between. But watch what happens when I try to take this pawn and then the lion. It doesn't let me. So because the intervening piece is a pawn or go-between, that's not legal. Now here's a similar rule regarding 2 lions that are both protected. So here, this queen protects this lion, and this rook protects the white lion. Now here's an in-between piece, a gold. This lion cannot take the white lion because it's being protected, so it has to gain a piece of value before it does so. So again, a piece of value is something that's not a pawn or not a go-between. So take the gold first, and now I could take the white lion. White's rook can retake, but black walked away with value out of the trade. And then here's the counter example. Now the in-between piece is a go-between, and I can't take the lion because the go-between is relatively worthless. Finally, we have the counter capture rule, and this basically boils down to exchanging lions, but in this case where the lions aren't attacking each other, but rather non-lion pieces are attacking it. So here the black bishop is attacking the white lion, but the white rook is attacking the black lion. Well, the black bishop could easily take the white lion, which is fine. But look what happens if I try to retake the black lion as white. That's illegal. So the rule is, if and 9 lion takes another lion, then you can't counter capture and take the opponent's lion in the following turn. Or basically, again, you can't simply trade off 2 lions. So in this situation, white's best move is to just run away, rather than anticipating a counter trade. Just one quick tidbit. If I do take this lion, and then white does something else, and then black for some reason leaves his lion unprotected, so for example doing that, then it's perfectly legal to take the lion. So that rule only applies to 2 consecutive turns. Now finally, there's one more interesting rule regarding the lion. And it's not really a rule, but it's just something that comes out of its unique movement. Remember how the lion is a 2-step piece, so you take a step out, but you can always just take a step back to where you started. So what this means is that what I just did is black effectively just passed his turn, and now it's white's turn. And there may be some situations where you want to give up tempo in order to force the opponent into a bad move. So that's it for the lion moves. To summarize, you can always take another lion if they're right next to your lion, but if the lion is 2 steps away, you can't take it if it's protected. However, you can take it if it's protected if you take a piece in the way that has value greater than a pawn or go-between. And finally, you can't retake the opponent's lion with a normal piece if they just took your lion with a normal piece. It's a lot to remember, but please feel free to rewatch this section of the video as many times as you need till it makes sense. Now that we know all the lion rules, I just want to reference back to an early part of the video where I said when you bring the pawn to the final rank, you have one more option to promote or under-promote. And there is a situation where you may want to under-promote the pawn. And this is a good example of that. So here we have a white lion protected by one of its pieces and a black lion protected by one of its pieces. A black pawn is about to promote to the last line if it chooses. So what happens if it promotes? Well, white gets to take out both of them. And black does get to recapture, but white got the better deal out of that. But if black chooses to underpromote, now he can't go further, and all it can do is just take that piece and go back. And black gets to keep his position and his lion gets to stay alive. So that wraps it up for the rules of Chushogi. And for the rest of this video, I'll talk briefly about general strategy and how to approach the game. And the first thing about approaching a chess game is to know the values of the pieces. Now it's a little tricky in Chushogi because there's so many pieces and they also have promotions that vary differently from each other. Here's a table that was published by the German Chushogi Association, and they give these values to the pieces, and here you notice that the king and the prince are also on this list, and that only happens, and it's only in a situation where you have both of them together. Otherwise their value becomes infinite. However, I'm not really a huge fan of this system because, for example, if you look at the Phoenix and the Keating, they're both rated only about 3 points relative to a pawn, which is just 1 point. But once they promote, they're basically as good as a lion or queen. And so I think their value depends more on where they are on the board and how close they are to promotion. And so you can't just use these piece values as face value. One thing I do agree with is that the lion is an extremely powerful piece. Here you can see it's rated 20. And this is almost twice as much as the queen, which is worth 12 points. Anyways, here is a listing of pieces according to Wayne Schmidberger. And he doesn't assign actual values to the pieces, just relative value. And I prefer this. So again, you can see the lion and the queen at the top. But in general, the theme is ranging pieces, or also known as sliders. They're worth the most after the lion. And obviously the queen is the best of them. And then when you get down to more limited sliders, such as the vertical movers and side movers, they're worth relatively less. And obviously the weakest of them is the lance and the reverse chariot. And below them you have the single step movers. So here they're on the right side because I ran out of room. At the very bottom is the pawn and go-between. And then as I alluded to earlier, pieces that have more potential to promotion have more value. And that's why you have the Keating and the Phoenix pretty high up on the list. So here, the Phoenix is valued almost as much as a rook, because it could turn into a queen. And similarly, the Keating, which could turn into a lion, is also rated pretty highly. And for that matter, pieces that are unpromoted but are still powerful, so for example, the Dragon King and the Dragon Horse, are worth more than the promoted ones, because the promoted ones are basically done. They don't have any future potential, but this Dragon King could become an eagle down the line, so that's why it's much more valuable. And how about the eagle and the falcon? They're basically queens, so their value is approximately that of a queen. And speaking of the eagle and falcon, I forgot to mention this in the lion rules part, but as I mentioned in the first video, these two pieces have lion type moves, but these lion type moves are not restricted by the rules I mentioned in the previous part of this video. But that said, they also have the ability to pass like a lion because they can go forward and then back to their original starting spot. Okay, finally, let's talk about some basic true shogi strategy. And to get you started, some general principles you want to do for your opening is to activate your lions almost immediately. So common openings may look something like this, where you bring your lions out in front. Keep in mind that you want to keep your lions protected so they can't be sniped by the other lion. So you generally want to have the lion protected by a pawn or another ranging piece. So speaking of ranging pieces, you want to activate those pieces. So for example, moving this pawn up starts to activate the diagonal for this horse and the bishop behind it. Now the opponent may do something similar like that, but you also want to be flexible and activate as many lines as possible. So for example, I could do this, which starts to push open my rook file, but on top of that I give another square for this horse to move to. So for example, after this, now my horse will start to exert coverage over this diagonal, and it's not blocking the diagonal of its other bishop. So part 1, activate your lion. Part 2, activate your ranging pieces. And in part 3, get your single step pieces out. And you want to move the single step pieces that are relatively weakest because they're more like cannon fodder. So, for example, your copper general is a good example. You want to move this guy out to the front so that he can help you out in making more effective trades. And a lot of the early to mid game in Chushogi is just making trades that are better for yourself and also moving your lion to places where it can get some free kills, which are usually going to be pawns and go-betweens. And then slowly but surely you develop a material advantage that you can use to push your advantage and win the game. Now another question that Shogi players might have is, what about castles? In Shogi, castles are a huge part of the game, and they're basically structures that are used to help protect the king, which is especially important in shogi because there are a lot of piece drops and the king can be attacked from any number of directions, including from within, so you want to emphasize king safety. True shogi is a lot more like chess because there are no drops, but castles do exist, and especially with so many ranging pieces and the lion, which is such a powerful piece, you still want to keep your king protected. So as the piece count starts to dwindle down, you may start thinking about making a castle. It's not as imperative as in standard shogi, but there are some things you can do. So here's an example of a castle that I saw on Wikipedia, and you can see here that all of these pieces protect each other really nicely, and there's no way a ranging piece or even the lion can directly threaten the king, and therefore they can't fork the king with another piece. So if you ever find yourself on a defensive, this is a good strategy to employ. Now keep in mind that you still need to protect the rest of your territory, because if you group all your pieces to protect your king, you leave a lot of empty space, and empty space is room for where the opponent can promote his pieces. And if you let your opponent promote pieces, then it doesn't matter if you have a castle or not, they'll break through and win the game. So there you have it, all the rules for True Shogi as well as a few tips to get started. Please feel free to give it a try on leeshogi.org. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe.